This morning we're continuing our series, Tales of the Sea. These are stories that happened on the Sea of Galilee and around the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus' ministry, for the most part, was focused. These are important stories for the earliest church as they faced the challenges in their life, and they remain important for us as well in our lives. Our story this morning is a strange one. In fact, it's kind of a spooky story. You can imagine that if you lived in Gergesa, the village where this took place along the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's in the region called the Decapolis, 10 Greco-Roman cities on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. A place that Jesus took his disciples quite often, which was a strange thing for Jesus to do. Jesus and his disciples were Jews, and Jews for the most part avoided going over to the other side, it's called, over and over again in the New Testament. But that's where Jesus took his disciples, over and over again, to the other side, to rub shoulders with people that were very different from themselves, Gentiles, not observant Jews, as it would be on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Imagine that you live there, and in the middle of the night, you wake up quite often to the sound of moaning and wailing, even howling. In the middle of the night, coming from the cemetery, and you know what it is. There are stories about the man who lives among the tombs. He's naked. He cuts himself with stones. He wails and moans and howls. People avoid him. They avoid the cemetery, but especially because of this man who lives among the tombs. There are lots of stories about him, but they're not just stories. He's real. He's a real person. Nobody really knows his name. He has a name, but nobody knows it. He's the man who lives among the tombs, the one with the unclean spirit. The people in that day and time, in that place, their understanding of the world was very different from our own. And so they lived in what one commentator calls a demon-haunted world. They avoided the cemetery because there were evil spirits that were likely to be there. They avoided the cemetery because this man who had an unclean spirit lived there. And they attributed this poor man's severe mental illness to possession by demonic forces. And so if you lived in Gergesa, you kind of became used to it. You didn't go anywhere near there if you could help it. You avoided him, but you were used to the sounds, you were used to the stories, and children frightened one another with stories about the man who lived among the tombs. I wonder if he didn't live among the tombs because it was a safe place for him to be. He had been ostracized, of course. His behavior was so bizarre that no one wanted him around. And not only that, people were afraid of him. And he was afraid of them as well. They had tried to restrain him on a number of occasions, but he was able to escape from the bonds. And so he lived among the tombs. Perhaps it was safer there. People avoided the cemetery. He could be there without being bothered by anyone. This really came home to me this past week, a week ago this morning, as a matter of fact. When I arrived at the church, I'm always the first one here. It's the wee hours of the morning. And as I approached the west entrance to the church, sitting there was a young man who asked me as I approached. He was obviously homeless, I assumed, from the way he was dressed. And he said, "Are you a priest?" And I said, "Well, I'm a pastor. I'm one of the pastors here at the church." He didn't want anything except to talk, and he asked me if he could talk, and I said, "Okay." So I talked with him for a few minutes and had a prayer with him, and then I came on into the church. But in the course of that conversation, he told me that most of the time he slept in the cemetery because he felt safe there, because he knew no one would bother him there. I wonder if that's true of this man who lived among the tombs, if he was there because he could be left alone. His existence was terrible. He cut himself with stones, it says. Maybe so he could just feel something. I mean, we don't know what was going on with him. But it was terrible for this man. Jesus and his disciples have been on the Sea of Galilee at night. They're approaching the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the other side, where the Gentiles are, the 10 cities, the Decapolis, Greco-Roman cities. And as they approach, this man who lives among the tombs comes forward and he cries out, "Jesus, Son of God Most High, do not torture me," he says. "What have you to do with me?" he asks. "What have you to do with me?" Jesus responds not by answering that question verbally, but by helping the man. But he asks him a question. "What is your name?" I think that question in itself had to be healing for this man who everyone avoided. But Jesus asked him a question. What is your identity? Who are you? What is your name? And his answer is profound. Because he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Legion is a word imported straight from the Latin. It's a Roman word. It refers to a number of soldiers. It's a unit, a military unit. A legion is about 6,000 soldiers. My name is Legion. I can imagine that over and over again through the years he had seen Roman soldiers marching to and fro, going from one place to the other. This is Roman-occupied territory. It's a Greco-Roman area where he lives. He would have seen legions of soldiers, and I can imagine that at some point he decided, that's who I am. I'm many. I'm fragmented. I'm at war within myself. My name is Legion. Now, as we think about this very strange story, we can imagine a little bit, just a little bit, what he meant when he said, "My name is Legion." Now, most of us in the room, I don't think, are as fragmented as that. Not that many warring selves within us, but isn't it true that sometimes we look in the mirror and we say to ourselves, to that person staring back in the mirror, "Why did you do that? Why did you say that?" As if there is this other self or these other selves within us that we think, where did that come from? That feeling of being, to some extent, Legion. There's the old story about the psychologist who was interviewing her new patient, and she asked the question, "Does everybody get along in your home?" And her patient answered, "Well, I live alone, and no, we don't." You know what that's like? Even the Apostle Paul wrestled with this when he said, when I want to do what's right, I can't seem to do it. I know the thing that I should do, and I don't do it. I know what I should not do, and that's the very thing I do. Oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? That's the Apostle Paul wrestling with this notion of being Legion. I ran across a piece from Anne Frank's diary in which she wrote, "My biggest problem is there's more than one Anne Frank." Anne Frank, that young girl who's on the cusp of adulthood, who's wrestling with the terrible things going on all around her and the plight of her life and her family. And she's thinking about this issue of being sort of legion. And so as I think about this story for us, this very strange story, I think about how it applies in that way. And then what Jesus does. What Jesus does is somehow through the power of Christ, Jesus helps this man become whole. He helps him move from this fragmented, tormented self to being whole. That speaks to us. As we are in relationship with Christ, as we are in community with one another, one of the things that we can accomplish through Christ and through our faith community is helping to become integrated people, to become more whole. And that's the power of Christ at work in us. We see that in this story. There is that very strange part where Jesus allows this legion to go into a herd of swine, and they go down the cliff and they all drown. I see that as a way of talking about the power of Christ to vanquish evil and to make whole in a dramatic way. But it's not just legion that I want us to think about this morning. We can see ourselves there, I think, most of us, and we can imagine something of what he encountered. But I want us to think about those townspeople. Because when I think about the meaning of this story for us and what it might say to us, my mind goes to them and to the challenge that they present. Because after this man is made whole, he's standing there fully clothed. He's clean. He's standing there with Jesus. They see him, and their response is irrational. Their response is they're afraid, and their response is, out of that fear, to get rid of Jesus. Jesus, we don't want you here anymore. Go away from here. Depart our region, they say to him. What a response. You read that response and you think, who's possessed here? This man has been made whole, but who's possessed now? Is it the town folk? Possessed by their own fear? Or more likely, possessed by the damage to their livelihood. I mean, after all, 2,000 pigs drowned in the sea, that's not good. Not good for the economy in the Decapolis. And they're possessed, perhaps, by their own possessions. And that can happen. I think the challenge of identifying with these townspeople is the challenge of that question, what's more important? The wholeness of a person or the stuff that we possess? Our own livelihood, our own comfort with the way things are, with the routine. All of that's been disrupted by Jesus. We want Jesus out of here. I think that's the challenge of these town people, the challenging question. What is most important for me? And for you? What matters most? It's not just a hypothetical question, really. It is a question that really goes to the heart of the decisions we make about our lives, how we live our lives, what we do with what God has entrusted to us as individuals and as a community, as a nation, as a world community. It really goes to the heart of what we deem to be most important, and it challenges us at the point of our fears. Because these townspeople are afraid, they act irrationally. They get rid of this healing, transforming presence called Christ. They want him out of there. It's a reminder that fear causes us to act in irrational ways, in ways that can harm us and harm others. When you think about, if I can use this term, and when you think about the demons that we face today, when you think about injustices, when you think about racism and bigotry, when you think about the horrific evil that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, that Casey so eloquently spoke to at the beginning of our service, that we all have on our hearts and minds today. When you think about those things that we face, when it comes right down to it, so much of it is fed by fear. Fear that can cause us to harm ourselves and harm others. There's a lighthearted story that's one of my favorites that comes out of East Texas. Two young boys, John Henry Falk and Boots Cooper, these little boys in East Texas, loved to play Texas Rangers. That's what they loved. In their imagination, they were brave Texas Rangers. Mrs. Falk sent these brave Texas Rangers to the hen house one day because there was a chicken snake terrorizing the hen house that needed to be dealt with. So she sent the Texas Rangers out there, and they rode off on their broomstick horses with full courage and bravery to face the menace of the chicken snake. And they looked on the bottom shelves, and there were no snakes in the bottom nest on the bottom shelf. And so they climbed up where they could just peer over into the nest on the top. And when they raised up, there facing them was a chicken snake right in their faces. Well, these two brave Texas Rangers nearly made a new door in the hen house. As they tried to run through the door simultaneously, they knocked themselves over, and they got up scraped and bruised and with a bent hinge on the hen house, and they scrambled out of there, and they ran for the porch where Mrs. Falk was laughing hysterically. And she said to them, "Now, boys, you know that a chicken snake can't hurt you." To which one of the little boys replied, "No, ma'am, but he can sure scare you to make you hurt yourself." That's what fear does sometimes, doesn't it? It's the fear itself that can become destructive, can hurt us and hurt others. It's the fear itself that can twist and warp our minds to have ideas that are destructive and hurtful. It's fear itself that can fuel so much of the evils and the ills in our society. When I read this story, I think about those townspeople, and I'm challenged to ask the question, who's really possessed here? And I think after the man who lived among the tombs, after Legion is no longer Legion, when he has a new name and he can't refer to himself that way anymore, those town people are still possessed. And they're possessed by their own possessions, they're possessed by their own fear, and they want Jesus out of there. You know, we don't say it this way generally, in quite this direct way, but that question, Jesus, Son of God Most High, what have you to do with us, is a question that's often posed when the gospel of Jesus Christ confronts one of the social ills in our society. When it confronts attitudes, when it confronts practices that are destructive, the question that comes back is, Jesus, what do you have to do with this? Just stay in church where you belong and don't be roaming the region, transforming lives. We learn a lot from these townsfolk. But we also learn from this man who now has a new name. Understandably, when this happens, when the townspeople react as they do, and Jesus is getting in the boat to leave as they ask him to do, understandably, this man wants to go with Jesus. I mean, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want to go and be one of Jesus' disciples after what Jesus had done for you? Wouldn't you want to go and follow him? But more than that, wouldn't you want to get out of that place? I mean, how in the world can he make his way into that tight-knit village? He doesn't have a place anymore. His place is over in the tombs, but now what does he do? But he wants to go with Jesus, and Jesus says, no, you can't. What you need to do is go back to your people and tell all the wonderful things that the Lord has done for you. Jesus leaves the region, but Jesus does not leave without a witness. One who will go and tell the story of God's grace, one who will go and tell the story of transformation, the story of getting a new name, the story of going from living among the tombs in that place where death reigns to new life. Christian tradition says that this is the first missionary to the Gentiles. Even before the Apostle Paul, this man goes and tells the story throughout the Decapolis, the 10 cities, the Greco-Roman cities, among the Gentiles. And don't you know that as he told that remarkable story of transformation, there were others who were also transformed by the power of Christ? Don't you know that when he went and told that story of being set free from his torment and being set free from his isolation and from his fears, that others could catch a vision of the kingdom of God that Jesus came to bring, of that abundant life that Jesus came to offer? Our call as God's people in this world, as those who seek to follow Jesus, is to go and tell of what God has done for us, of what God is doing in the world, to go and be witnesses in the face of fear, be witnesses to confident trust, to go as witnesses in the face of hatred to love, to go as witnesses in the face of exclusion to gracious and loving acceptance. That's our call. What we can learn from this story is not just from Legion, but from the man who used to be Legion. There's a hymn, and I want to close with 2 verses of it, not singing it, but reading it. It's one of our hymns in our hymnal. It's a new hymn. That is, I still speak of this as the new hymnal. It came out in 1989. But this hymn was included for the first time. It was written in 1984 by Thomas Traeger. It is a hymn that's very difficult to sing. In my whole ministry, I've only had a congregation sing it once, and afterwards somebody said, "Don't ever do that again." It's difficult to sing, but the words are very powerful, and the second and third verses are in the form of a prayer, and I want to read those. Lord, the demons still are thriving in the gray cells of the mind. Tyrant voices, shrill and driving, twisted thoughts that grip and bind, doubts that stir the heart to panic, fears distorting reason's sight, guilt that makes our loving frantic, dreams that cloud the soul with fright. Silence, Lord, the unclean spirit in our mind and in our heart. Speak your word that when we hear it, all our demons shall depart. Clear our thought and calm our feeling. Still the fractured, warring soul. By the power of your healing, make us faithful, true, and whole. Amen.